Sarah Martinez sat in her car outside the courthouse, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. The October sun was beating down mercilessly on the windshield, and even with the air conditioning blasting, she felt suffocated. Her breath came in shallow waves. She'd been sitting in this parking lot for 17 minutes, unable to move, unable to gather the courage to step out and face what awaited her inside that imposing stone building. Buddy, her golden retriever mix, pressed his warm nose against her neck from the back seat, as if somehow he knew that she needed grounding. His soft brown eyes reflected concern, the kind of intuitive awareness that had saved Sarah's life more times than she could count. She reached back and stroked his silky ear, drawing comfort from the simple act. Buddy had been with her through the darkest periods of her life, and today, he was her anchor in a storm of uncertainty. The reason Sarah was terrified had nothing to do with legal procedures or courtroom etiquette. It had everything to do with her sister and the impossible position she found herself in. 3 years ago had spiraled into addiction. It started innocently enough, painkillers after a car accident, but within 18 months it had consumed everything. She lost her job, her apartment, and most painfully, custody of her 2 children, 9-year-old and 7-year-old Emma. They were taken by social services on a cold February morning while sat in a rehabilitation center, hollow-eyed and desperate. Sarah had been the one to take Emma in. She'd rearranged her entire life around being their guardian. She'd learned to braid Emma's hair from YouTube tutorials. She'd helped with his homework every night. She'd driven them to school, to therapy appointments, to weekend visits with their mother in treatment facilities. And through it all, she'd watched really fight for her life back. Now, 18 months later, was genuinely transformed. She had been completely sober for over a year. She'd attended every therapy session, completed every program requirement, and worked as a barista at a local coffee shop. She'd rented a small house with 2 bedrooms, one for Emma. She'd furnished it with love and care. Most importantly, she'd done the psychological work to understand why she'd turned to drugs in the first place. But when Sarah had told her family about its progress and her intention to testify in support of her sister regaining custody, the response had been brutal and overwhelming. Their mother had actually cried. "She'll use again," their mother had said, her voice shaking. "You're delusional, Sarah, is a liar and an addict. Once an addict, always an addict." Their brother had been even harsher. "You're going to destroy your own life trying to save hers. Don't expect us to pick up the pieces." Even Sarah's best friend, Jennifer, had gently tried to discourage her. "I know you love her," Jennifer had said, "but what if your mother is right? What if she relapses? You'll feel so guilty. You'll blame yourself." The doubt had invaded Sarah's mind like poison. Was she being naive? Was her love for her sister clouding her judgment? But then she would visit, watch her interact with Emma, see the tears in eyes when her children hugged her. That's when Sarah knew was genuinely different. The woman she'd known before, the one who was emotionally absent, who prioritized drugs over her children, was gone. In her place was someone raw and honest and desperately fighting to be better. So Sarah had agreed to testify. She would tell the judge what she'd seen. She would describe the progress, the transformation the genuine love had for her children. It seemed simple enough. It seemed right. But as the court date approached, Sarah's anxiety disorder, something she'd battled since her early 20s, began to spiral out of control. The anxiety had started when she was 22 years old, during her junior year of college. She'd had her first panic attack in the middle of a lecture, convinced she was dying. For years afterward, she'd struggled with crushing self-doubt and the constant physical symptoms of fear: racing heart, shortness of breath, trembling hands, a pervasive sense of dread that seemed to have no rational cause. She'd been to therapy, tried medication, and had slowly learned to manage it through breathing exercises and lifestyle changes. But courtrooms terrified her. The idea of standing in front of a judge, in front of her sister's ex-partner who was fighting against custody claim, in front of lawyers trained to find inconsistencies and twist words, it triggered every anxiety spiral she'd ever experienced. She'd imagined hostile questioning, her mind going blank, her words failing her at a crucial moment. She'd imagined breaking down in tears, being perceived as unreliable or emotionally unstable. She'd imagined letting down when her sister needed her most. That's where Buddy came in. Sarah had gotten Buddy 2 years ago, right after she'd started taking in an Emma. A shelter dog, Buddy had arrived at her home traumatized and aggressive, scared of his own shadow. But something had clicked between them. Sarah had worked with a trainer specializing in service animals and anxiety disorders, and Buddy had proven to be extraordinarily gifted at recognizing the physical signs of Sarah's panic attacks before they fully manifested. When he sensed the subtle changes in her breathing, the tensing of her muscles, the slight shift in her energy, he would alert her with a gentle nudge, allowing her to practice grounding techniques before the panic completely took hold. It was a skill that had kept Sarah functioning. It had allowed her to keep her job, maintain her friendships, and be present for an Emma. Without Buddy, she honestly wasn't sure she would have survived the last 2 years. But bringing Buddy to court, that was a risk. Most people didn't understand service animals for mental health conditions. They saw anxiety as something you should just get over or push through. She'd heard the judgments countless times. You're not really disabled. You just need to think positive. Other people handle stress without a dog. She feared that bringing Buddy to the courtroom would undermine her credibility, that the judge would see her as weak, that it would reflect poorly on his case. Yet, not bringing Buddy meant facing the hearing completely unprotected, vulnerable to a panic attack at the worst possible moment. Sarah had gone back and forth on the decision 100 times. Finally, yesterday, she'd called her therapist, doctor, who had encouraged her to bring Buddy. "You have a legal right to your accommodations," doctor had said firmly. "Your anxiety is real. Your coping mechanisms are legitimate. Buddy isn't a crutch. He's a tool that helps you access your best self." So here Sarah was, parked outside the courthouse at 8:47 a.m., her hearing scheduled for 9:30 a.m., feeling more terrified than she'd ever been. She took another deep breath, felt Buddy's reassuring presence beside her, and finally gathered her courage. She was going to do this. For an Emma, for herself. The courtroom was colder than Sarah had expected, not just in temperature, though the aggressive air conditioning was certainly doing its part, but in atmosphere. The walls were painted a sterile beige, and the high ceilings made every sound echo unnaturally. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow. There was no warmth here, no compassion built into the architecture. Just steel, marble, and the weight of institutional judgment. Sarah sat in the gallery with her support person, Michael, who worked as a social worker and had volunteered to accompany her. Buddy lay at their feet, his leash slack but secure, his brown eyes calm and alert. They'd practiced this scenario dozens of times over the past month, sitting in silence, Buddy remaining perfectly still and quiet while Sarah navigated her anxiety. Michael squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You've got this," he whispered. The courtroom was filling up gradually. Sat at the table with her attorney, a woman named Jennifer Park who was sharp and competent but wore the worried expression of someone fighting an uphill battle. The opposing counsel sat at the other table, a man Sarah would soon learn to dread. His name was, and he radiated the kind of confidence that came from winning more cases than he'd lost. He was impeccably dressed in a navy suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression fixed in an expression of relaxed power. Sarah watched him shuffle through papers with the casual ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Judge entered from her chambers at 9:28 a.m., and everyone stood. She was a woman in her late 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her expression was neutral but somehow cold, the kind of neutrality that came from seeing humanity at its absolute worst day after day for decades. She settled into her high-backed chair with a sigh that suggested exhaustion rather than anticipation. The hearing began with opening statements. Attorney outlined the case, A woman who had recognized her addiction, sought help, completed multiple treatment programs, maintained employment, and was now ready to resume her parental responsibilities under supervised conditions. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like a success story. Then stood up. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth as silk. "While we appreciate Ms. Martinez's efforts, we must consider the welfare of the children. Addiction is a disease of relapse. The statistics are clear. Over 70% of individuals struggle with substance abuse disorder, experience at least one relapse within the first year of recovery. We're talking about the lives of two innocent children, not a social experiment in second chances." Sarah felt her stomach drop. The percentage he cited, she wasn't even sure if it was accurate, but it sounded damning. More importantly, it set the tone for the entire proceeding. This wasn't going to be about genuine progress. This was going to be about fear, about worst-case scenarios, about convincing the judge that it was too risky to trust someone with a history of addiction. The first witness was a psychologist who had made significant progress, and that the risk of relapse could be managed with continued therapy and random drug testing. Cross-examination was polite but devastating. He asked leading questions. Isn't it true that therapy is only effective if the patient is truthful? And isn't deception a hallmark of addiction? The psychologist tried to defend her position, but had already planted seeds of doubt. Then Sarah was called to the stand. She stood on shaky legs, walked to the front of the courtroom, and placed her hand on the Bible held by the bailiff. The words of the oath washed over her. "Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. She settled into the witness chair, which was positioned slightly elevated and facing the judge. From this vantage point, she could see everything: the judge's impassive face, the attorney's body language, and most importantly, she could see Buddy. Michael had positioned himself and the dog where Sarah could catch glimpses of them if she needed grounding. Jennifer Park, attorney, began with gentle questioning. She walked Sarah through her relationship with, asked about her observations of recovery process, and had her describe specific instances that demonstrated change. These questions felt safe. Sarah answered them clearly, painting a picture of a sister transformed, attending AA meetings, working consistently, completing her therapy, maintaining a clean home, and interacting with her children with genuine love and patience. For about 15 minutes, Sarah felt almost confident. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Maybe she could do this. Then stood up. He didn't begin with hostility. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he smiled warmly and said, "Ms. Martinez, I appreciate your love for your sister. Family loyalty is admirable. Let me ask you a few questions to clarify your testimony." The first question seemed innocent enough. "How many times have you personally drug tested your sister?" Sarah hesitated. I haven't." "So you haven't independently her sobriety. You're relying entirely on her word." "She's court-ordered drug testing." "I'm not asking about court-ordered testing. I'm asking what you personally know." He smiled again, but it was a predator's smile now. "Isn't it true that addicts are, by the very nature of their disease, exceptionally skilled liars?" "She's not lying about this." "You didn't answer my question. Aren't addicts fundamentally dishonest?" Sarah's heart rate accelerated slightly. She was being cornered, forced into a position where any answer she gave could be twisted. "I think that's an oversimplification." "Let me ask you this," interrupted, his voice taking on an edge of aggression now that he'd softened her up. "Before your sister's addiction, did you ever suspect she was using drugs? Did you notice it immediately?" "No, but—" "So she hid it from you for months, possibly longer, correct?" "Yes, but—" "And now you're asking this court to place two children back in her care based on what? Your belief that she's different. Your hope that she won't relapse." Sarah's palms were beginning to sweat. Her breath was coming slightly faster. The courtroom felt smaller, the air thicker. She could feel anxiety creeping in at the edges of her consciousness like fog rolling in from the ocean. "I've observed significant." "You've observed what you want to see," said, cutting her off completely now. His politeness had evaporated entirely. "Isn't it true that you've been raising your sister's children for nearly 3 years? Isn't it true that you've become emotionally invested in your sister's recovery? And isn't it therefore reasonable to suggest that you might be biased in her favor?" Sarah's mouth went dry. Her throat constricted. This wasn't fair questioning. This was a verbal assault dressed up in legal language. He was dismantling her credibility piece by piece, suggesting that her love for her sister made her testimony unreliable. He was implying that she was naive, emotionally compromised, that her judgment couldn't be trusted. "I'm not biased," Sarah said, but her voice wavered. "I'm telling you what I've witnessed." "What you've witnessed, or what you want to believe," leaned against his desk, relaxed, confident. "Isn't it possible that your sister is simply an excellent actress, that she's telling you what you want to hear?" The panic was building now. Sarah could feel it, the tightening in her chest, the quickening of her pulse, the sense of unreality that sometimes preceded a full panic attack. The room seemed to tilt slightly. She gripped the arms of the witness chair, trying to ground herself. "I don't think," she began but wasn't finished. "You don't think. Exactly my point, Ms. Martinez. You're thinking with your heart, not your head. And your heart wants to believe in your sister's redemption so badly that you're willing to risk 2 children's safety. Isn't that true?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Her vision blurred slightly at the edges. She was drowning, and nobody in this courtroom seemed to notice or care. She caught a glimpse of Buddy from the corner of her eye, watching her with those steady, knowing eyes. She needed him. Sarah's chest constricted violently. The fluorescent lights above seemed to pulse in rhythm with her racing heartbeat, each flicker an assault on her already fragile nervous system. She could feel sweat forming on her upper lip, dampening her palms. Her breathing had become shallow, rapid, almost hyperventilation. The physical symptoms of a panic attack were beginning their familiar, terrifying cascade through her body. Continued his assault. "Ms. Martinez, I asked you a question. Aren't you willing to risk children's safety for your sister?" "I'm not," Sarah tried to speak, but her voice came out weak and strained. The room was spinning now, or at least it felt like it was. She could see Judge watching her from behind the bench, but the judge's expression remained neutral, clinical. To the judge, Sarah probably looked like any other anxious witness. She didn't understand that Sarah was on the precipice of a medical emergency. The panic attack was building like a storm system, gathering strength and velocity. Sarah's mind began fragmenting into disconnected thoughts. What if he's right? What if I'm putting an Emma in danger? What if relapses? What if this is all my fault? The spiraling thoughts fed the anxiety, which fed more thoughts, which generated more anxiety. It was a vicious cycle that she knew intellectually she couldn't control through willpower alone. Her hands began to tremble. She clasped them together in her lap, trying to hide the shaking, but it was too late. Had already noticed. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. He was enjoying this. He could smell weakness like a shark smelled blood in the ocean. "Isn't it true?" continued, his voice adopting an almost conversational tone, as if they were having a casual chat rather than engaging in legal combat, "that your sister has a documented history of manipulation, that she's used people, including you, to enable her addiction?" "That's not fair," Sarah whispered, but even she could barely hear her own voice. The roaring sound in her ears, the rushing, whooshing sensation that always accompanied her panic attacks was becoming louder. Her peripheral vision was beginning to darken. This was bad. This was really bad. She looked desperately toward Michael and Buddy. Her support person's face had transformed from calm reassurance to concern. He could see the signs. He knew what was happening. Michael's hand had moved to Buddy's collar, ready to help if needed, but he was waiting for Sarah's signal. That was important. Buddy was trained to respond to Sarah's specific cues, not to Michael's instructions. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard now that she thought everyone in the courtroom could probably see her chest heaving. She was acutely aware of every eye on her. The opposing counsel was savoring her distress. At her table, looked stricken and confused. Judge had paused, waiting for Sarah to answer the question, but Sarah couldn't form words anymore. Her throat felt like it was closing, though she knew rationally that it wasn't. The worst part about panic attacks was the sense of unreality, the feeling that she was losing control of her own mind and body. The rational part of her brain, the part that had attended countless therapy sessions, that understood cognitively that this panic would pass, that knew she wasn't actually dying, was being drowned out by the primal survival instinct that screamed, "Danger! Escape! Now!" She gripped the arms of the witness chair so hard her nails dug into the wood. She couldn't do this. She couldn't testify. She couldn't help. She was going to have a full panic attack in front of a judge, in front of everyone, and it was going to destroy her sister's case. Was still talking. His voice sounded distant and distorted, like she was hearing him through water. "So you have no independent verification of your sister's sobriety, no objective evidence. Just the word of an admitted liar and drug addict." That's when something shifted inside Sarah. A small voice, beneath the panic, beneath the fear, beneath the spiraling thoughts, whispered, "You're not alone. Buddy is here. Let him help." Her eyes found Buddy's again. The dog was sitting perfectly still, his entire body language conveying absolute focus and attention. He was watching her like she was the only being in the entire universe that mattered. His calm, steady presence was like an anchor in a storm. Sarah made the signal. It was subtle, so subtle that most people in the courtroom probably didn't even notice. She simply tapped her leg twice, the same gesture she and Buddy had practiced hundreds of times in therapy sessions, at home, in safe environments where she could learn to trust her own healing. It was a small movement, barely visible, almost imperceptible. But Buddy saw it. In one fluid motion, the golden retriever stood up. His leash, which had been loosely held by Michael, became completely slack. The bailiff started to move, probably thinking the dog was about to cause a problem, but Buddy moved with such purposeful grace and complete training that it was obvious this was no accident. This was deliberate. This was trained behavior. Buddy walked directly toward the gate that separated the gallery from the courtroom proper. He navigated around it with the ease of an animal who had practiced this move before, which he had, during sessions at the courthouse with Sarah's attorney to prepare for this exact possibility. He stepped through the opening and walked directly to the witness stand, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. The entire courtroom went silent. It was the kind of silence that felt almost physical, like someone had muted the world. His voice died mid-sentence. His mouth actually fell open. Judge's pen froze above her notepad. The court reporter's fingers stopped their rapid-fire clacking on the keyboard. Even the ambient hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade into insignificance. Buddy sat down directly in front of the witness stand, in the space between Sarah and the rest of the courtroom. He was perfectly positioned, not blocking the judge's view, not disrupting the proceedings in any obvious way, but completely present, completely committed to Sarah. His body language was alert but calm. His eyes remained locked on Sarah's face with an intensity that suggested nothing else in the world existed for him except her. And something extraordinary happened. Sarah's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to slow. Her heart rate, which had been racing like a frightened rabbit's, began to stabilize. The physical presence of Buddy, the visual confirmation that she wasn't alone, that she had support and protection, it was like a circuit breaker being flipped. The panic didn't vanish entirely, but it lost its grip. It loosened its stranglehold on her throat. The entire courtroom remained frozen. Everyone was staring at the dog. Sarah could see the confusion on people's faces, the uncertainty about what was happening. Some of them probably thought it was a disruption. Some of them probably thought it was a stunt. but a few people, and notably Judge, seemed to recognize what was really occurring. The judge set down her pen slowly and removed her glasses. She studied Buddy with an expression that had shifted from judicial coldness to something warmer, something that looked dangerously close to understanding. Stood there, his aggressive momentum completely shattered. He looked down at the dog, then at Sarah, then at the judge, seemingly unsure how to proceed. This scenario hadn't been covered in law school. There were no objections he could raise, no legal arguments he could deploy against a service animal performing its trained function. Sarah took a long, shaky breath. The oxygen filled her lungs properly for the first time in what felt like hours. She looked down at Buddy, and the dog blinked slowly at her, the universal sign of a dog's love and trust. In that moment, surrounded by the confusion and shock of the courtroom, Sarah felt something shift, something fundamental. She was no longer drowning alone. Judge had presided over family law cases for 25 years. In that time, she had witnessed countless human dramas: desperation, manipulation, genuine transformation, and heartbreaking denial. She had developed a nearly impenetrable emotional armor. She had learned to view the courtroom not as a place where justice happened, but as a place where competing interests clashed and someone had to make a decision that would inevitably hurt at least one party. She had become expert at maintaining distance, at separating her personal feelings from her professional obligations. But something in her chest shifted when she saw the dog. At first, Judge's instinct had been purely judicial. A dog had entered the courtroom without authorization. It was a disruption to proceedings, a potential security issue, something that needed to be addressed immediately and firmly. Her hand had actually moved toward her gavel, but then she'd paused. She'd watched the dog navigate the courtroom with purpose and training. She'd observed the way Sarah's entire body responded to the animal's presence, not with excitement but with gradual calming. The judge had seen panic attacks before, had recognized the telltale signs: the rapid breathing, the white-knuckled grip on the chair arms, the glassy, unfocused eyes. And she'd watched all of those symptoms begin to recede as the dog sat down in front of the witness stand. Judge had removed her glasses and studied the scene in front of her. 23 years earlier, her daughter had returned from college after a traumatic incident, the specifics of which had never fully disclosed, and which the judge respected as her daughter's right to privacy. Had developed severe post-traumatic stress disorder. She'd struggled with panic attacks, hypervigilance, and a pervasive sense of fear that seemed to color every moment of her life. Had tried therapy, medication, all the conventional treatments. Nothing had worked until she'd been paired with a service dog named Saxon. The transformation had been miraculous, had gone from barely being able to leave her apartment to graduating law school. Yes, her daughter was now a lawyer, following somewhat in her mother's footsteps and building a relatively normal life. Saxon had been the key. The dog had given back her autonomy, her confidence, her sense of safety. Judge understood in a deeply visceral way what was happening in her courtroom right now. This wasn't a disruption. This was a lifeline. She studied Sarah Martinez carefully. The young woman's color was returning to normal. Her breathing, while still somewhat elevated, had stabilized to something approaching regular rhythm. The woman's hands had unclenched from the death grip they'd maintained on the chair arms. Most tellingly, Sarah was looking at the dog with an expression of profound relief, as if she'd just been pulled from drowning. Was staring at the dog with an expression somewhere between bewilderment and indignation. His mouth opened and closed a few times, like a fish gasping for air. He looked toward Judge as if expecting her to immediately remove the animal and restore his courtroom advantage. He clearly believed this was a disruption, an interruption to his carefully orchestrated verbal assault. Judge was having none of it. She set her pen down with deliberate care. She made a small gesture to the bailiff, who had been starting to move toward the dog. "Stand down," she commanded quietly, her voice carrying absolute authority. "Nobody touches the animal." A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. People exchanged confused glances. His face flushed slightly. He was not accustomed to being thwarted, not accustomed to judges siding against him. Judge leaned back in her chair and observed the scene before her with the focused attention she usually reserved for reading legal briefs and reviewing case files. She watched Sarah's breathing continue to normalize. She watched Buddy's steady, unwavering focus on his owner. She watched the profound relief wash across Sarah's features as the immediate panic crisis began to resolve itself. The judge had seen her daughter's service dog perform similar alerts hundreds of times. She recognized the training, the discipline, the profound bond between handler and animal. She knew that what she was witnessing wasn't a trick or a stunt. It was a medical accommodation, pure and simple. It was a woman with a disability accessing the support she needed to function in a high-stress environment. "Ms. Park," Judge said, addressing his attorney, "do you have additional questions for this witness?" Jennifer Park seemed stunned by the question. She looked between Sarah, the dog, and the judge, clearly unsure how to proceed. Your Honor, I think Ms. Martinez needs a moment. She seems distressed." Judge nodded thoughtfully. "Ms. Martinez, are you able to continue testifying, or do you need a brief recess?" Sarah took another deep breath, visibly gathering herself. She glanced at Buddy, then back at the judge. Her voice, when she spoke, was still somewhat shaky but noticeably stronger than it had been minutes earlier. "I can continue, Your Honor. Thank you." Judge turned to face directly. Her expression was cool, clinical, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Mister, you may continue your cross-examination, but I'm warning you now. This court recognizes that Ms. Martinez has a service animal that assists her with a medical condition. Any continued aggressive questioning that appears designed to aggravate her condition rather than seek legitimate testimony will be noted in the record. Do you understand?" His face turned almost purple. "Your Honor, with respect, this is highly irregular. There are no accommodations on file for—" "Your Honor," Judge interrupted, her voice dropping to a temperature that somehow felt colder than ice, "I didn't ask for your opinion on the irregularity of the situation. I asked if you understand my directive." The courtroom was now completely silent. Everyone understood that they'd just witnessed a significant shift in the judge's demeanor, swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." "Good," Judge said, settling back into her chair. She turned her attention back to Sarah. "Ms. Martinez, you may continue. Please take your time." Sarah nodded, her hand moving down to briefly touch the top of Buddy's head. The physical contact seemed to ground her further. She looked directly at the judge and then at Jennifer Park, ready to continue. Judge made a mental note to herself to look into the legal precedents regarding service animals in courtrooms. Something told her that this case might become important, that her decision here today might have implications beyond just Martinez's custody hearing. She thought of her daughter, of how many other people might be struggling with similar situations, might need this kind of judicial recognition and compassion. She also made a note to look into his file. His aggressive tactics, while perfectly legal, had crossed a line today. A lawyer's job was to advocate zealously for their client, but not to deliberately target a witness's medical vulnerability. That was the kind of behavior that needed to be documented. But first, she needed to let this hearing proceed fairly. She needed to see if Sarah Martinez could deliver her testimony with the support she required. She needed to determine whether Martinez deserved a second chance with her children. Judge picked up her pen again, but her demeanor had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a neutral arbiter. She was someone who understood that true justice required compassion, accommodation, and recognition of human vulnerability. She was no longer the cold, distant judge who had entered the courtroom that morning. She was a mother who understood what it meant to watch someone struggle, and a judicial officer who was willing to do something about it. The question now was, would continue his assault, Or would he recognize that something fundamental had shifted in his favor? He would continue. Sarah was certain of it, but at least now she had backup. At least now the judge understood what was really happening. At least now she wasn't alone. Opened his mouth to continue his line of questioning, but before he could speak, Judge raised her hand. "We're going to take a 15-minute recess," she announced, her tone brooking no argument. "Bailiff, please clear the courtroom." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. 15 minutes was not a typical recess duration in a custody hearing. Usually, if a judge called a break, it was for maybe 5 minutes, just enough time for people to stretch and use the restroom. 15 minutes suggested something more significant was happening. Confusion rippled through the courtroom. Looked toward his client, a man Sarah recognized as ex-partner, someone who'd been surprisingly uninvolved in their daughter's upbringing even before addiction issues, with a shrug that suggested he had no idea what was going on. Jennifer Park's attorney looked cautiously hopeful but uncertain. Herself looked confused and slightly terrified, as if the recess might mean bad news. Sarah remained in the witness stand, her hand still resting on Buddy's head. Michael had moved to stand closer, his face showing concern and curiosity. Judge waited until the courtroom had mostly cleared, then gestured to both attorneys. "Ms. Park, Mr. approach the bench." The two attorneys moved forward, speaking quietly with the judge in the kind of hushed, inaudible conference that was common in courtrooms. Sarah watched their body language, trying to read what was being said. Seemed argumentative. Jennifer Park seemed to be explaining something. Judge's expression remained neutral and judicial, but Sarah caught something in the judge's eyes, a determination, a resolve. After about 2 minutes, the judge made a gesture. "This recess is not for all parties," she announced. "Ms. Park, Mr., you may wait in the hall. Bailiff, please ensure that only Ms. Martinez and her support person remain in the courtroom." More confusion, more exchanged glances between the attorneys, but judicial orders were not suggestions, they were commands. Both lawyers filed out, shooting Sarah a look that suggested he knew something was happening that was disadvantageous to his case. Once the courtroom had cleared to the judge's satisfaction, Judge rose from her bench. "Ms. Martinez, would you please follow me to my chambers? Your support person may accompany you." Sarah's heart rate, which had just begun to normalize, spiked again. What was happening? Was she in trouble? Had she done something wrong by bringing Buddy? She stood on shaky legs, and Buddy immediately moved to her side, pressing against her leg supportively. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he whispered. "The judge is helping, not punishing." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced, and followed Judge through a door that led away from the courtroom. She'd never been in a judge's chambers before. The space was surprisingly warm compared to the cold formality of the courtroom. Wood-paneled walls, soft lighting, comfortable-looking leather chairs arranged around a substantial desk. On one wall hung photographs, Judge with various people at different stages of life. There was one photo that caught Sarah's attention. A young woman with a large German Shepherd service dog, both of them smiling at the camera. Judge settled into a leather chair and gestured for Sarah to do the same. Michael stood nearby, still present but attempting to give them some privacy. Buddy curled up at Sarah's feet, his body language suggesting that he understood they were in a safe space now. "Ms. Martinez," Judge began, her voice completely different from her courtroom tone. It was gentler, more human, less judicial. "That dog, he's a service animal, isn't he?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. He's trained to recognize panic attacks and alert me when one is beginning. I've had severe anxiety disorder since my early 20s. The judge nodded thoughtfully. She turned slightly in her chair to look at the photograph on the wall. "That's my daughter," she said quietly. "The dog's name is Saxon. He's a service animal too, has PTSD. Without Saxon, I'm not sure she would have been able to finish college, let alone go to law school and build a career." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Understanding flooded between them, a recognition that the judge wasn't just a stern legal authority, but a mother who understood the profound difference that a service animal could make. "I didn't know judges could have." Sarah trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Family members with disabilities," Judge offered with a slight smile. "Oh, we do, more than you'd think. And I'll tell you something, Ms. Martinez, when I watch with Saxon, when I see how that dog allows her to access her own strength and resilience, I see something I've never forgotten. I see the importance of accommodation. I see the reality of invisible disabilities. I see the difference between judging someone for needing help and recognizing that needing help is deeply human." The judge leaned forward. "That cross-examination you were subjected to, that was designed to aggravate your anxiety, wasn't it? To make you appear unstable." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "I think so. I mean, I understand that attorneys are supposed to vigorously cross-examine witnesses, but it felt like he was deliberately trying to make me fall apart." "He was," Judge said flatly. "And what he did was unethical, though it's unfortunately not uncommon. Some attorneys view aggressive cross-examination as their right, even when the target is a vulnerable witness. But in this courtroom, we're going to do things differently." The judge stood and walked to her desk, pulling out a small notepad. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to finish your testimony. When you return to the witness stand, Buddy will be positioned closer to you, not in a way that interferes with courtroom procedures, but in a way that allows you to see him and access his support. If at any point you need a short break to compose yourself, you just signal and we'll accommodate that. And Mr. will conduct his cross-examination in a manner that seeks information rather than deliberately agitating a witness with a medical condition. If he crosses that line, I will stop him." Sarah felt tears beginning to form. "Your Honor, thank you. I was so scared I was going to let my sister down." Judge's expression softened further. "Let me tell you something I've learned over 25 years on the bench, Ms. Martinez. The people who make the best witnesses, who testify with the most credibility, are the ones who are honest about their vulnerabilities. You came to this courtroom knowing you struggle with anxiety. You brought a trained service animal to help you manage that. You didn't hide it or deny it, you faced it head-on. That takes courage. That takes integrity. That's the kind of person juries and judges believe." She returned to her seat. "Now tell me about your sister. Not for the record, this is just between us. Tell me what you've actually observed. Tell me what you really believe about whether she can be a good mother to her children." For the next 10 minutes, Sarah talked. She talked about the she'd known before, emotionally distant, prioritizing substances over everything else. She talked about the she'd watched emerge from rehabilitation, raw, honest, committed to being different. She talked about the specific moments that had convinced her of her sister's transformation. The night had held Emma while she cried about missing her mother. The morning had gotten up early to make breakfast for before taking him to school. The afternoon had sat in therapy and finally admitted the depth of her own pain that had driven her to addiction. Judge listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When Sarah finished, the judge nodded slowly. "I believe you," the judge said simply. "And I think you're going to tell the truth in that courtroom without fear, because you won't be alone. Buddy will be there. And I'll be watching to make sure Mr. doesn't try those tactics again." As Sarah and Michael stood to leave, Judge added one more thing. "Ms. Martinez, your sister is lucky to have you, and those children are lucky to have an aunt who loves them this much. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." When Sarah returned to the witness stand, Buddy positioned himself exactly where she could see him clearly. Tactics had changed noticeably. He was still aggressive, still challenging, but there was a boundary now that he wouldn't cross. Judge was watching his every word. Sarah took a deep breath, looked at Buddy, and prepared to tell the truth. The courtroom had a different energy when everyone filed back in after the recess. Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on what had changed, but she could feel it in the air, a subtle shift in the dynamics, of power and authority, took his seat with a slightly jaw than before. His client looked uncertain, as if sensing that his attorney's strategy had been compromised in some way. The court reporter returned to her position, ready to capture every word that would be spoken. Most importantly, Buddy was now positioned directly in front of the witness stand, his presence no longer hidden in the gallery, but openly acknowledged and integrated into the courtroom proceedings. Judge had made a small but significant adjustment to the physical layout, one that made it clear that Sarah's accommodation was not merely tolerated but actively supported by the court. Judge resumed her position on the bench. She looked down at Sarah with an expression that was professional but unmistakably warmer than it had been before the recess. It was a look that said, "I see you. I understand. You're going to be okay." "Ms. Martinez," Judge said formally, "you're still under oath. Mr. will now continue his cross-examination." Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. She reached down and let her fingers brush against Buddy's ear, a small gesture that only she and the dog understood. It was a way of saying, "I'm ready. Let's do this together." Stood, his posture was the same as before, confident, assured, but something about his demeanor had definitely changed. He no longer had the predatory quality that had characterized his questioning during the morning session. His eyes kept flicking toward Judge, as if checking the boundaries of what he could and couldn't do. "Ms. Martinez," he began, his voice now carefully modulated to sound reasonable rather than aggressive, You've observed your sister's recovery process over the past 18 months. Can you describe for the court what you mean by transformation?" This was a different kind of question than before. It wasn't a trap or an attack. It was an actual request for information. Sarah felt her shoulders relax slightly. She looked at Buddy, drew strength from his steady presence, and began to speak. "Struggled with addiction," Sarah said clearly, her voice now firm and composed. Before that, she was someone she was emotionally unavailable. She loved her children, but she couldn't show it in healthy ways. She was distant, unpredictable, sometimes angry. But the woman I've come to know in the past year and a half, that's someone completely different. "Can you provide specific examples?" asked, and Sarah realized he was actually setting her up to do what he should have been doing all along, asking for substantive testimony rather than trying to pick it apart. "Yes," Sarah said. 3 months ago came home from school and said he'd gotten a B on a math test. He was devastated because he's usually a student. The one before recovery, probably would have either ignored it or made him feel worse about it. But this, she sat down with him and asked what had happened. She helped him understand that one bad grade didn't define him. She told him about her own struggles in school, about how failure had actually taught her important things about persistence. She turned his disappointment into a learning opportunity. Sarah's confidence was building now. With each specific example she provided, her voice grew stronger. Emma had nightmares for months after being removed from care. She still has them sometimes, but sleeps with her when she has them now. She doesn't just comfort her, she validates her fear. She says things like, "I know you're scared. I know this is hard, but I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." Those are things the old never would have said. Judge was taking notes, her expression engaged and interested. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing every word. In the gallery, people were actually leaning forward, drawn into Sarah's testimony by its specificity and emotional authenticity. "Works at a coffee shop now," Sarah continued, "and I've been there to pick her up from shifts. I've watched her interact with her. She's kind. She's reliable. She shows up on time, something that was impossible for her 2 years ago. Her manager has told me that is one of her best employees. That's someone who is genuinely trying to rebuild her life from the ground up." Shifted his weight. "And in all of this time," he said, his voice still measured and careful, "have you observed any concerning behaviors, any signs that she might be struggling?" It was a fair question, an honest question, and Sarah appreciated that. "Yes," she said honestly. There are times when I can tell she's struggling emotionally. Recovery isn't a straight line, it's complicated. But the difference is that now when she struggles, she reaches out. She calls her sponsor. She goes to therapy. She talks to me. 2 years ago, when she was struggling, she reached for pills. Now she reaches for connection. That's a fundamental difference. "Thank you," said, and he actually sounded like he meant it. He turned to the judge. "No further questions at this time, Your Honor." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash through her. The cross-examination was over and she had survived it. More than that, she had thrived. She had told the truth, clearly and powerfully, with Buddy's steady presence as her anchor. "Ms. Park," Judge looked towards attorney, "do you have any additional questions for this witness?" Jennifer Park shook her head. "No, Your Honor, the witness has been very clear." "Very well," Judge said. She looked at Sarah directly. "Ms. Martinez, thank you for your testimony. You may step down." As Sarah gathered her things and made her way out of the witness stand, she caught Sarah's eye. Her sister was crying, not sad tears, but tears of gratitude and validation. Sarah mouthed the words, "I love you," and mouthed them back. Sarah returned to her seat in the gallery with Michael and Buddy. The rest of the hearing proceeded without her, but she could feel the momentum had shifted. The testimony about transformation, delivered with clarity and specificity by someone who lived with the children and knew their mother intimately, had landed. It had created a different narrative than the one had been trying to construct. During the lunch break, Judge's law clerk approached Sarah in the hallway. "The judge wanted me to give you her contact information," the clerk said, handing Sarah a card. "She said if you ever need to contact her regarding accommodations in future legal proceedings, you should reach out. She's documenting today's case as a potential precedent for service animal accommodations in courtrooms." Sarah took the card, stunned. She looked at the name, Judge, and the phone number on it. "She also said," the clerk continued with a slight smile, "that Buddy is welcome in her courtroom any time. She said he demonstrated more integrity and composure than most witnesses she's seen." By the end of the day, when Judge had finished hearing all the testimony and arguments, she announced that she would be taking the case under advisement and would deliver her ruling within 2 weeks. As everyone filed out of the courtroom, Judge caught Sarah's eye and nodded slightly, a small gesture of acknowledgement and respect. Sarah understood that she had been part of something bigger today. She hadn't just in her sister's custody hearing. She had stood up for her own right to accommodation. She had demonstrated that vulnerability and support weren't weaknesses in the pursuit of justice. They were essential components of it. And she had done it with Buddy by her side, 14 days. That's how long Sarah waited for Judge's ruling. 14 days of checking her email obsessively, of jumping every time her phone buzzed, of barely being able to sleep despite Buddy's calming presence beside her in bed. Had been equally anxious, though she tried to hide it for and Emma's sake. The children had sensed the tension, though, and had become clingy and uncertain. Then on a Friday afternoon, Sarah received a call from Jennifer Park. "The ruling came down," the attorney said, and Sarah could hear the smile in her voice. "You need to read it yourself. I'm emailing it to you right now." Sarah's hands shook as she opened her laptop. The document was lengthy, more than 30 pages, which was unusual for a custody ruling. Typically, these decisions were concise and to the point. But as Sarah began reading Judge's written opinion, she understood why this one was different. The ruling itself was clear. Martinez would regain full custody of her children, effective immediately, with conditions including continued participation in therapy, random drug testing twice monthly for the first year, and regular check-ins with a court-appointed family services coordinator. These were standard conditions for a case like this, reasonable safeguards that protected the children while allowing their mother to rebuild her relationship with them. But it was the reasoning section that made Sarah's breath catch. Judge had written extensively about documented recovery, her completion of treatment programs, her employment history, her housing situation, and the testimony provided by Sarah Martinez. But then the judge had done something extraordinary. She had addressed the courtroom proceedings themselves. During this hearing, Judge wrote, I observed firsthand the difference that appropriate accommodation can make in the pursuit of justice. Ms. Sarah Martinez arrived at this proceeding with a legitimate medical disability, anxiety disorder, which is well documented and clinically recognized. Rather than allowing this disability to prevent her from testifying, she sought appropriate accommodation through the use of a trained service animal. This decision demonstrated not weakness, but courage and integrity. It demonstrated a commitment to truth-telling that transcended her own fear. Sarah read the next paragraph aloud to herself. Service animals are recognized by the Americans with Disabilities Act as legitimate medical devices. When a witness requires such accommodation to access their full capacity to testify truthfully, courts have an obligation to provide that accommodation. Today's ruling establishes a precedent. Emotional support and service animals are welcome in this courthouse when they serve a documented medical function. Furthermore, this court recognizes that witnesses who openly acknowledge their needs and use appropriate accommodations are often more, not less, credible than those who attempt to hide their vulnerabilities. Sarah's eyes were streaming with tears by the time she finished reading. Judge had not just ruled in favor. She had validated Sarah's choice to bring Buddy. She had created legal language that could be cited in future cases. She had taken a single moment of vulnerability and transformed it into something with broader implications. The ruling was published on the court's website that afternoon, as was standard procedure. But something unusual happened. A legal blogger picked up the story and wrote about it, emphasizing the unique aspects of Judge's decision regarding service animals. The post went viral within legal circles. By evening, it had been shared more than 10,000 times. By the next morning, it had reached mainstream media. The local news station in the city ran a story titled, "Judge Makes Historic Ruling on Service Animals in Court." The reporter had interviewed both Jennifer Park and, who, to his credit, acknowledged that Judge's approach was reasonable and that he respected the ruling. But the real story that emerged was about Sarah and Buddy. Someone had captured cell phone video of Buddy walking to the witness stand during the hearing. The footage, which had been shared through legal circles, made its way onto social media. Suddenly, people who had nothing to do with the case were watching this golden retriever move across a courtroom with clear purpose and intention. Comments flooded in. "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Finally, a judge who understands disability rights. "This dog just changed the justice system." "I have anxiety. This gives me hope that I could testify if I needed to." Major news outlets picked up the story. Within 48 hours, Sarah received calls from journalists at NPR, CNN, and the New York Times, all wanting to interview her about her experience. She was overwhelmed, hesitant, unsure about whether she wanted to be public about her mental health struggles. But then she received a phone call from Judge herself. "Ms. Martinez, I hope you don't mind the informality of calling you at home," the judge said warmly. "I wanted to check in and see how you're doing with all of this media attention." "I'm honestly overwhelmed," Sarah admitted. "I don't know if I'm comfortable being so public about having anxiety disorder." Judge was quiet for a moment. "I understand that instinct to keep it private, but consider this. How many people are suffering silently right now, thinking that their anxiety disqualifies them from participating fully in society? How many people might be thinking, if Sarah Martinez can do this, maybe I can too? Sometimes being public about our struggles is the most powerful thing we can do." That conversation shifted Sarah's perspective. She agreed to do a lengthy interview with NPR, during which she talked openly about her anxiety disorder, her journey with Buddy, and the pivotal moment in the courtroom. She described what it felt like to be drowning in panic while trying to serve her sister's justice needs. She talked about the fear and shame she'd felt about her disability, and she talked about Judge's compassion and understanding. The NPR interview aired on a Sunday morning and immediately became one of the most listened to pieces from that week. Suddenly, Sarah's email was flooded with messages from people around the country sharing their own stories of invisible disabilities, of struggling to be heard because of mental health challenges, of feeling validated and seen for the first time. His custody case became a touchstone for broader conversations about disability rights and courtroom accommodation. Legal scholars began citing Judge's ruling in academic papers about disability law. Several other judges reached out to Judge asking for guidance on accommodating service animals in their own courtrooms. One state legislature even began drafting a bill specifically protecting the rights of witnesses with service animals to have their animals present during testimony. 2 weeks after the ruling, Sarah received an invitation to speak at a legal conference about her experience. A month later, she was invited to testify before her state's Judicial Ethics Committee about accommodations for witnesses with disabilities. 3 months later, she was asked to join the board of a national organization devoted to disability rights in the legal system. But perhaps most significantly, something shifted in how people perceived Sarah and others like her. The viral video of Buddy walking across the courtroom had become iconic. It represented not the weakness of needing help, but the strength of seeking it. It represented the power of accommodation. It represented the intersection of vulnerability and courage. Thrived with her children. Within 6 months, the court-ordered drug testing was reduced to monthly. Within a year, it was discontinued entirely. Had not only maintained her sobriety but had become a peer counselor at her rehabilitation center, using her own story to help others find their way to recovery. But the impact extended far beyond family. Across the country, people began talking differently about service animals in public spaces. Attitudes shifted. Accommodations became more accepted. Most importantly, people began understanding that disabilities, visible and invisible, were not shameful things to hide but legitimate aspects of human experience that deserved respect and accommodation. And it all started because Sarah Martinez had the courage to tap her leg twice and let her dog help her tell the truth. Judge's ruling had not just changed one family's life. It had created ripples that spread far beyond that single courtroom, touching lives and changing minds in ways that Sarah was still discovering months later. When she thought back to that morning in the parking lot, to her terror and uncertainty, to the voice in her head saying she was weak for needing help, Sarah understood something fundamental. Vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of strength. The nonprofit office was small but filled with purpose. Sarah stood in front of the window on a sunny morning in April, 6 months after that pivotal day in Judge's courtroom, and marveled at how quickly everything had changed. The office was located in a converted Victorian house in downtown, with high ceilings and natural light streaming through tall windows. A hand-painted sign on the door read, "Courage and Calm, Service Animals for Anxiety Support." She wasn't alone in the office. Michael, her support person from the courtroom, had left his social work position to become the nonprofit's program director. Jennifer Park, attorney, served on the board of directors, and perhaps most surprisingly, had become a consulting member of the advisory board, not out of guilt or forced obligation, but because he'd genuinely been moved by the experience and wanted to advocate for better treatment of witnesses with disabilities. Buddy lay on a comfortable dog bed in the corner of the office, occasionally lifting his head to check on Sarah, his brown eyes reflecting the same steady concern that had become his trademark. At 7 years old, Buddy had become something of a celebrity in his own right. His photograph hung on the wall of the office, alongside before and after photos of other individuals who had completed the nonprofit's service animal training program. The work had consumed Sarah's life in the best possible way. After the NPR interview and subsequent media attention, she'd been contacted by dozens of people asking for help training their own service animals for anxiety. She'd quickly realized that there was a massive gap in services. While training organizations existed for guide dogs and mobility assistance dogs, there were far fewer resources specifically for service animals trained to recognize and respond to anxiety and panic disorders. So she'd started Courage and Calm. The nonprofit's mission was straightforward: provide training and certification for service animals that could alert individuals to panic attacks and anxiety episodes before they fully manifested. But the real work was more nuanced than that. Sarah spent as much time educating people about their rights, helping them understand that needing accommodation wasn't shameful, as she did actual dog training. The program had started small, just 5 dogs in the first cohort. Now, 6 months later, they had 23 dogs in various stages of training, and the waiting list stretched out for another year. Sarah's phone had become a constant source of connection. People called her from across the country. Lawyers hesitant about courtroom testimony, teachers anxious about classroom presentations, military veterans struggling with PTSD. People of all backgrounds discovering that they didn't have to let their anxiety keep them from participating fully in the world. Had become one of Courage and Calm's most vocal advocates. She worked with Sarah part-time, using her own story to encourage program participants. She had returned to school, pursuing a degree in social work, with the goal of eventually working with individuals in recovery from addiction. Her relationship with Emma had deepened, and the children still saw their father regularly, but was no longer the ghost in their lives. She was present, engaged, truly their mother in every meaningful sense. Just last week, had made the honor roll at school and had specifically asked his mother to attend the ceremony. Emma had started piano lessons and played her first recital for an audience that included both her parents, her aunt, and her Aunt Sarah's famous dog, Buddy, who sat in the front row and received almost as much applause as Emma did. But perhaps the most significant development had come from an unexpected quarter. Judge had taken Sarah to lunch 3 days ago at an upscale restaurant downtown. They'd sat at a corner table, and the judge had gotten straight to the point. "I'm thinking about writing a book," Judge had said without preamble, "about disability rights in the legal system, about what I learned from your case, about my daughter and her service dog. I want your help." Sarah had been stunned. "Your Honor, I'm not a writer, You're someone who lived it," Judge had interrupted gently. "And you have a voice that people listen to. Together, we could create something meaningful, something that might change how judges approach these issues, how attorneys treat vulnerable witnesses, how society understands disability accommodation." They'd talked for 2 hours, and by the end of the lunch, Sarah had agreed to collaborate on the book. The working title was The Weight of Justice: Finding Compassion in the Courtroom. The impact of that single moment in the courtroom had continued to radiate outward in ways that still amazed Sarah. Legal conferences across the country had begun inviting her to speak about courtroom accommodations. A major law school had incorporated a case study of her testimony into their evidence course. Several states had passed new regulations, specifically protecting the rights of witnesses with service animals. But perhaps most meaningfully, the conversations about mental health had shifted. Where once anxiety disorders and panic attacks had been treated as personal weaknesses to be overcome through sheer willpower, there was now broader recognition that these were legitimate medical conditions deserving of accommodation and support. Sarah received emails regularly from people saying things like, "I finally told my boss about my anxiety and asked for accommodations. I never would have had the courage if I hadn't read your story." One email in particular had moved Sarah to tears. It came from a woman in Colorado named who wrote, "I was supposed to testify in a custody hearing about my sister just like you. I was terrified. I have severe social anxiety, and I was convinced I would fall apart on the stand. I read about what you did with your dog, and I decided to try something similar. My dog doesn't have formal service animal training like Buddy, but he's my emotional support animal, and I requested accommodation in the courtroom. The judge agreed. I stayed calm, My sister got her children back. And none of that would have happened if I hadn't read your story and realized I wasn't alone. Thank you for changing my life." Sarah had framed that email and hung it in her office next to Buddy's photograph. The original viral video of Buddy walking across the courtroom now had over 3 million views. It had spawned countless articles, think pieces, and discussions about the intersection of disability rights and the legal system. Most surprisingly, it had become a touchstone for conversations about vulnerability in professional settings. Business leaders cited it when talking about creating more inclusive workplaces. Therapists showed it to clients struggling with shame around their disabilities. The video had become proof of something Sarah had learned through her own journey, that acknowledging our struggles and seeking appropriate support wasn't a sign of failure. It was a sign of wisdom and self-awareness. Today, though, Sarah was thinking about something more personal. She was thinking about that morning in the parking lot, sitting in her car, convinced that she was too broken, too anxious, too much of a liability to help her sister. She was thinking about the moment when she doubted whether bringing Buddy was the right decision. She was thinking about how terrified she'd been, how certain she was that her anxiety would destroy his case. And then she thought about Judge's words in her chambers. "Your sister is lucky to have you, and those children are lucky to have an aunt who loves them this much." She thought about transformation, now a year and a half into sobriety, thriving in school and work and her relationships with her children. She thought about an Emma, stable and happy and secure in the knowledge that their mother loved them and was fighting for them. She thought about the hundreds of people who had been helped through courage and calm. She thought about the legal precedents being set, the conversations being had, the minds being changed. All of it had started with a tap on her leg, and a dog who loved her enough to do what she needed him to do. Sarah walked over to Buddy's dog bed and sat down beside him. The dog immediately shifted, resting his head on her lap. She stroked his ears, feeling the familiar comfort of his presence. "We did good, didn't we, Buddy?" she whispered. Buddy's tail thumped against his bed, his response to hearing his name spoken with love. Sarah realized that she'd been waiting for her life to truly begin, waiting for the moment when she'd be fixed enough, functional enough, normal enough to do the things she wanted to do. But that moment had never come. Instead, she'd learned to live with her anxiety, to work around it, to let it be part of her story rather than the entirety of her story. The vulnerability she'd felt in that courtroom, it hadn't been a weakness that needed to be overcome. It had been the doorway to her actual strength. She thought about the email she'd received yesterday from a judge in another state asking for advice on setting up service animal accommodations in her courtroom. She thought about the interview she was doing tomorrow with a podcast about disability rights. She thought about the book she'd soon be writing with Judge. She thought about all the people who would read her story, or watch the video, or hear about her experience, and would understand for the first time that they too deserved accommodation, support, and respect. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened her notes app. She had an idea for an article she wanted to write. What I learned about courage from my dog. As she began typing, Buddy pressed against her leg, his solid presence grounding her, supporting her, reminding her that she was never truly alone. The vulnerability had led to strength. The fear had led to courage. And one woman's willingness to ask for help had created ripples that were still spreading across the country, touching lives and changing minds. That was the real power of the moment in Judge's courtroom. It wasn't about winning a custody case or getting accommodations in a single hearing. It was about proving that asking for help wasn't weakness. It was the foundation of strength. It was about showing that accommodations weren't favors, they were rights. It was about demonstrating that the most powerful thing a person could do was to acknowledge their struggles and then work with them rather than against them. Sarah had come to court that day terrified and uncertain. She was leaving it, not just that day, but now, 6 months later, transformed. Not transformed because her anxiety had disappeared. It hadn't. but transformed because she'd learned to live with it, to use it, to let it become part of her story rather than the end of her story. And Buddy, faithful and constant, would be by her side through every chapter that came next.